Howdy folks, Spencer here, and today I'll be going over my thoughts on the Tier 6 Steamrunner, which was released in the C-Store just yesterday on October 1st. The ship costs 3,000 Zen by itself, or 2,400 Zen with the launch sale. If you have a Tier 6 coupon, you can use it to get this ship. That's how I got mine. There is also a bundle available that contains the Tier 1, 5, and 6 versions of the ship alongside the Tier 5 and Tier 6 upgrade tokens to maximize those ships. The bundle will cost 5,000 Zen, but it will also be discounted to 3,250 Zen for the launch week for the ship. Unlike most single-release C-Store ships, this ship does not have a fleet version. Instead, the C-Store version is fleet equivalent. This is a very nice thing to see. It's a feature that is usually reserved for ships that are in a 3-pack bundle for each faction, like the Pilot Escorts, the Odyssey, the Scimitar, bundles like that. Now, let's dive into the ship itself. So the ship itself really leans itself in towards many aspects of a kinetic build. Its trait, its experimental weapon, its console are all focused around a very kinetic theme. And the overall setup of the ship just works really well for a torp and mine spam and boat, which is basically the current meta in high-end ISE runs right now. So what you see with the build I have up on the screen, it's not the full build. I might do a build video at some point in the future for this, but just an example for it really, is just what you would be doing for a kinetic setup on it. You'd be running the 4 standard torps that everybody runs. You'd be running a Thoron mine and whatever other 2 mines you want. The experimental weapon, I'll go over the experimental weapons here in a few minutes, but you're not going to be running the one that comes with the ship because it's not good. The rest of the ship is just set up really well, and if I go over to the bridge officer seating, we've got a commander tack, which is good for mine dispersal pattern beta 3 in this case, and fitting all of the other torp abilities on there I need. You've got a lieutenant commander tack / command, and having that lieutenant commander command seat is what really allows this ship to be a kinetic ship. If you don't have at least a lieutenant commander command seat on a ship, you can't really do torps that well because you don't have access to concentrate firepower 3. And because of how the mechanics of concentrate firepower work, you never want to run the lower ranks of it. Doing so is just going to screw over any teammates you have in the run that may be running a proper torp setup, as the lower ranks override the higher ranks and just really suck. The Lieutenant Commander Engineer is the weakest part of this ship, which I know may sound weird to a lot of you that are not familiar with the kinetic meta, but you want as little engineering seating on a torp build as possible, so that is one downside to the ship, but you can still make it work. So what I did with mine is I slotted a debuff with Let It Go 3, and then I used Emit Unstable Warp Bubble 2, or 1 right there, and that is an unconventional systems proc, and then we've got an ensign side that I've got my tractor beam on. That triggers the rapid emitting armament trait from the Dederidex, and it's also an unconventional systems trigger. And then on the lieutenant seat, which is a universal / intel, I've put in another science officer, and on what you see on the screen right now, it's just running a viral impulse burst, which is an uncon proc, and then a scramble sensors, which is another unconventional systems trigger. If you don't know what an uncon is, then there's a video that is going to be popping up on the screen. Go check it out. Basically, every time you hit a control ability, you're reducing the cooldown of your universal clicky consoles. So your things like DPRM, the Tricobalt console that comes with the ship, those are all being cooled down every time you hit a control ability, which is a very important aspect of the current meta. And now that we have the ship itself covered, let's take a look at each of the individual components that come with the ship. Okay, let's take a look at the Starship Trait piercing projectiles. When you activate a torpedo or mine firing mode, so a high yield or a mine dispersal pattern, you get 200 shield pen and 200 hull pen. Now, what this equates to is 10% shield penetration and 20% hull pen, which is pretty solid. The trait does not stack, so if I activate, let me just go back here and show you the stats. If I activate a high yield, you see that. If I activate a mine ability, nothing happens other than the duration of the buff has been refreshed up to 15 seconds. So there is no stacking of the trait. And for those that are curious, ETM does not trigger it. ETM, when you hit fire at will or scatter volley, gives you a torp spread, and that torp spread that you get from this does not trigger the trait. So for those that were wondering about that interaction, that is not a thing that will work. As for this trait, it is very good. I used this on the solo run that I did on the stream that you'll see at the end of this video, and it felt pretty good. I just don't know if you would exactly have room for it if you had all of the really premium Starship traits for Kinetic build, like Ruin, Subspatial, REA, or Universal Designs, like all these really premium traits. I don't think you would have room for it, but if you don't have access to those traits, which most of you won't, given that they are insanely expensive, this is very much a trait to consider slotting if you want to do a torp build. It is very potent. It just doesn't necessarily, beat out some of the other options we have at the very high end if you have access to every premium ship out there. Okay, so let's take a look at the experimental weapon, the experimental whole spike battery. And let me tell you, there was a lot of hope that this thing would perform, decently. But unfortunately, from every run that I have seen so far, it is really bad compared to other experimental weapons we have. The Soliton Wave Impeller is still one of the best ones, and the Protomatter Lace Sheller is also really good, but let me just show you some numbers. Let me get these pulled back up on the screen here. So I did a few runs tonight with the Steamrunner, and here on the left is a run where I did 1.6 million with the Steamrunner, and the whole spike battery did 13k, okay? 13k DPS for an experimental weapon is extremely poor in that level of run. On the right now is my run, another run I did with the Steamrunner, and I had 42k from the Soliton, which is not as good as it normally does, but it's still much closer to the normal for an experimental weapon slot at that level. Normally you want to see around 50k, and the reason my Soliton likely performed just slightly worse than that in this case was because I did not maximize my engine power like the Soliton benefits from. On the Kinetic builds, we run max aux power for this phase space membrane console to maximize the damage bonus from that. So, I did have some limitations for the Soliton here, but still quite consistently we were seeing in every run tonight that the whole spike battery was doing just a fraction of what these better experimental weapons do. I think, realistically, looking at the numbers of the whole spike battery, that you would have to just buff its damage up 4 times of what it currently is for it to even compete or have a chance at competing with what we already have. And I think there's some runs that if I was getting better numbers out of the Soliton, or if I was running the Protomatter Lace Sheller, which I don't have on that character yet, if this whole spike battery was buffed up 4 times, that the other experimental weapons would still be beating it. So you would need to buff this whole spike battery quite substantially for it to be worth anything. As is, it's just not worth slotting. I think there's better freebie or much more accessible experimental weapons out there. I know some people like Voice of the Prophets. The Soliton Wave Impeller is from an event ship, if people have it. It's from the Rising Corvette, I believe, from a few years back. There's the Flak Shot Artillery, which I believe does better than this. So, yeah, it's very, very subpar, which is truly a shame. So do not buy the ship if you were after the experimental weapon, because the experimental weapon is hot garbage. Okay, so let's take a look at the console for the ship now, the Tricobalt Terror Launcher. This has passives on it for plus 19% mine and torp damage. This is Cat 1, so it's like half of what attack console would give, basically. It's got plus 47.5 Starship Shield Pen, which basically works out to right around 2.4 or 2.5% shield penetration, which is, it's okay. And then we have the clicky that you fire it at a target and it shoots out 5 torps. And Cryptic nerfed this console pre-release because they were worried about it being too overpowered. And I can tell you, I've had really good luck with it in high-end runs where I have a lot of coordination and there's a lot of crowd control for all the mobs. But if you're a more casual player and you don't have access to, teammates that have even a gravity well slotted, this console's probably not going to do too well for you. Now, in the 1.7 mil run that I did earlier with this ship, I actually had quite a bit of damage come from this console, even though it has been nerfed. But I'm using it in a very specific set of runs with a lot of team debuff happening, a lot of crowd control. And I was hitting it at the start of the run against the tac cube, and then against the gateway with all of the spheres on it. If you're looking for the info for this in your parser, it's going to show up under both player and pets because it does have a dot to it. So in my case, in this 1.7 mil run, which is the best case scenario for this console to perform well, it did actually do quite well. The Tricobalts themselves did 54.6k DPS. And under pets, the subspace rift that they caused did another 32k. So in this extremely high-end environment, the console can perform well. However, you're not going to have that type of environment in those situations in most use cases. I still think that the console is worth slotting on a build, on a Kinetic build. I just don't know how valuable it's going to be for those of you that don't have some sort of crowd control in the run. If you don't have your own gravity well, if you don't have a graviton on, you may have some limitations with what type of performance you're seeing from it. But I still think it's a really fun console to use. I think it's a shame that Cryptic nerfed it so much pre-release. It would have been insanely powerful in the high-end runs in its prior state, but it would have made it much more viable for those of you that are just playing the game very casually. So I know I'm giving some mixed feedback with this console, but my basic summary is if you're on a torp build, it probably doesn't hurt to slot it. But if you're just on an energy weapon build or your exotic build and you're looking for something that can help you do more damage, this probably is not it. This is something that I would at most slot on a Kinetic build, which is what I've done here with my Steamrunner setup. So the basic summary that I can give you all with this ship is that it is a very solid Kinetic platform for those of you that are interested in getting into the Kinetic side of the game. The trait on it is pretty solid if you don't have any of the better traits. The console on it is good on a Kinetic build, but not so much for other things. And the experimental weapon is just complete garbage in its current state. It would need to be buffed up basically 400% to be competitive with the existing experimental weapons that we have. Let me just end this with a run that I did with the ship. This was a very high-end focused ISE run, so I've got a dedicated tank in here and 2 Kinetic support ships that are both bringing in a CF for me. I was running this without CF in the supported runs. Instead, I was running Call Emergency Artillery 1, and then I was entirely reliant on my teammates to give me concentrate fire powers on the primary targets. So, I am doing manual fire, so that's why the trays are set up like this. Manual fire is not necessary for Kinetic builds, but it is required if you want to compete at the very highest levels, as you need to have some control over which torp is firing at what time. So I'm heading into the start phase here, fully buffed up, lots of mines behind me. I hit all my abilities here at the start, including that Tricobalt console. It has a very nice animation when it fires off. It does a fair bit of damage still, even in its nerf state. I'm booking it to the left side. It was a pretty okay opening for this ship. My Call Emergency Artillery 1 misfired at the left side. Booking it over to the other side now that the left is dead. Just doing what I can basically at this point to take down the right side as quick as possible. And then I'm going to head over to the gate. Because I was using unconventional systems, I was able to get the Tricobalt console back up and available at the gate just a minute into the run. So that is why having ships that have so many science seats are so valuable, because you really want to be able to spam as many control abilities as you can with that to make sure you can use your universal consoles as often as possible. And then at this point, I start climbing at the tack cube because I'm on manual fire and I'm able to fire off Delphic high yields rather than the biomolecular high yields. The Delphic does much better under high yield for a single target than the EBM does. The EBM is greater against like a bunch of things that are grouped up at the gate, but the Delphic just hits really hard against a single target. Really, at 1707, that just to me shows just how capable of a platform this is. Is it going to beat the better platforms out there like the Courage, the Styx, the Rampart? No. But is it able to do really well and hold its own weight? Very much so. For a C-Store ship, it's just such an amazingly good value for an entry-level Kinetic boat that if that's what you're looking to get into, you really should be considering this ship. And to end the video, I'm going to show off a solo Infected Space Elite that I did with the Steamrunner on my stream yesterday. But before I cut off the audio and go over to that, I just want to say thank you to McStew for giving me a shout out last week. Go check out his channel if you haven't already, links down below. He's put out a lot of really nice guides, and I very much, as the person that administrates SCM, one of the things that I personally failed to do a while back was to make a proper guide on how to download and install the parser. So I appreciate that he went out and did the work and actually got a guide out there to help everyone figure out how to install the parser that wasn't familiar with how to do it already. So thank you to McStew, and I hope you all enjoy the solo ISE. The first one was a bit rough, but the second one that I'm about to show you it actually went pretty well. So enjoy. Goss is gonna watch this and just, I can already imagine your reaction is that you hate tacticals. Yeah, it's not as tanky as the Styx. I messed up a few things there at the start too that slowed things down just a smidge. That's dead. I'm just gonna go to the other side. I'm gonna die here very, very soon. I don't want to burn a CF on a sphere. And I'll burn on this one. Okay, I'm going to go to the back of the gate and probably die very shortly. What I need is my DPRM to come up, like, really bad. Need to get away from that tack cube before it just completely destroys me. EVM spreads are always painful to see. I am going a bit slower than I, could be, but I'm just trying to stay away and just pick off some of these smaller targets. Because otherwise these probes and spheres are just going to cause me a lot of issues when I try and take out the cube. Okay, that's good enough. Let's give me just a few seconds here. I mean, there was no deaths in that, so that's an improvement compared to the first one. 5 minutes, 25 seconds. That was also about a minute and a half faster than the first attempt.